What Viking poor food looked like. A Viking warrior could bleed in battle, then eat spoiled fish to stay alive. A mother could stretch bark bread and broth across 7 mouths. A child could last the winter on sour milk and seaweed stew. No harvest, no firewood, no feast. Just frostbitten fingers, bitter broth, rotting fish, and the unbreakable will to live another day. 3 days of bark-stretched barley bread for a family, while one roasted boar vanished in a single night of feasting among warriors. That is the truth the sagas often leave out, hidden beneath tales of conquest and glory. In the great halls of jarls and raiders, there was always more than enough. Outside those walls, in the humble cottages and turf-roofed huts, there was often nothing at all. When feasts did happen, they were spectacles designed to awe and intimidate. Torches and braziers cast flickering light on shields and shields, on polished axes, and gleaming helmets hung above long oaken tables. The cooks worked behind curtained alcoves, stirring massive cauldrons of meat and broth. Roasted boar, thick haunches of venison, and slabs of salted fish glazed with honey were carried in by servants in animal-skin tunics. The air was thick with steam, smoke, and the sharp tang of burning wood. Warriors and nobles stood or sat on benches carved from single tree trunks. They slammed their fists in time to drum beats, hollering war songs that echoed like thunder. Between verses they tore hunks of meat from bone, the juices running down their beards, flicking droplets onto the floor. Salt was carried in heavy bowls and poured without restraint, the crystals crunching under teeth. Mead flowed like water, filling horns until they overflowed, spilling sweet liquid that blurred the edges of the firelight. Above it all, the Jarl presided on a raised dais, his cloak of bear fur draped across his broad shoulders. He lifted his horn in a booming toast that shook the rafters. Every face turned to him, painted with flickering shadows, and replied in thunderous unison. The message was clear. This man ruled by strength and generosity alike. His power was absolute because he could feed all who came to his hall. The sages and scalds poets and storytellers wove their words between mouthfuls. They recited the deeds of gods and heroes, reminding listeners that they walked in their footsteps. Each tale ended with applause and laughter, followed by more meat and more mead. The feast lasted until the embers died, and the warriors, rafted with drunken joy, tumbled onto furs laid across the floor. But beyond these timbered walls lay another world. In small houses, dotting the frozen valleys, windows were nothing but holes stuffed with animal hide. The hearths held no braziers, only a simple iron pot hung from a hook above smoldering coals. There was no honey to glaze fish, no hams to roast whole. Instead, families lived on the mercy of a land that gave little and took much. The soil here was thin and rocky. A patch of barley might grow where a rock had been pried out by hand, a few handfuls of oats where an ancient tree once stood. In spring, fathers and sons plowed the earth with wooden plows tipped in iron, turning furrows before the last frost had fully retreated. Every seed was precious. Each handful of grain was carried to the field like a gift to the earth. If rains came too late or too early, if a sudden frost whispered through the grain in August, the harvest could fail. And when that happened, the long months of winter pressed in without warning. The wind howled through gaps in the walls, driving snow into corners. Streams and wells froze over. The world beyond the door became a silent white plain. In those moments, food became the most urgent concern. Bread, if it could still be called that, was coarse and gray. The last of the flour was mixed with ground inner bark, scraped from pine and birch. This cambium layer was bitter and fibrous, but it added bulk. The dough was pounded into thick, flat cakes and baked on a griddle over the hearth. The crust was hard, the center dense. Each bite scraped the gums and filled the belly more with effort than with sustenance. Gruel accompanied nearly every meal. Oats or rye grains boiled in water until they fell apart, the liquid thick and heavy. When milk was still available, thin whey from cheese making might be added, lending a faint sourness. If spring had been kind, wilted greens nettles, sorrel, dandelion might brighten the porridge in tiny flecks of green. But in deep winter those plants lay buried under snow. Then the gruel was simply pale mush, cold to the tongue, offering only the warmth of digestion. Meat was a legend, spoken of more than tasted. A family might save a marrow bone from a slaughtered goat or sheep, cracking it open with a small hammer to drop the scraps of marrow into a pot. That oily, rich fat was a treasured rizzled over porridge, ladled into a cup of hot water, or eaten by the smallest child who could manage the texture. Dried fish herring or cod lay in cracks of the cottage wall, smoked and salted in the months before. Soaked in water, then boiled, it became slim strips of gray flesh to be washed down quickly. Every scrap of protein was rationed through the day. Milk and eggs were rarer still. Goats and cows, if a family was fortunate enough to keep any, gave less milk in the coldest months. The thin drops that remained soured almost instantly, yet no drop was wasted. Families stirred curds into gruel, or drank the tangy whey before it curdled completely. Chickens laid few eggs when the ground froze solid. The eggs were held back for rituals, for bartering, or for the occasional gift to a sick neighbor. The contrast between feast and famine ran deep. Where the Jarl's Hall saw platters piled high, half a mile away farmers worried each sunrise whether the stores would last another day. Where warriors drowned in mead, the peasants sipped sour milk or weak ale. The horns and goblets were tokens of victory and wealth. The wooden bowls were tools of survival. Yet in this silence of scarcity lay remarkable resilience. Knowledge passed from mother to daughter. How to smoke fish over juniper wood so that it resisted rot. How to pack root vegetables in straw-lined pits to protect them from frost. How to ferment cabbage in wooden barrels to make a form of sauerkraut. This hidden curriculum was a form of magic, turning simple things into lifelines. Villagers gathered in small clusters during the brighter seasons to help each other harvest. They saved 1/3 of every field in a communal storehouse, overseen by the village elder. In bad years, those stores were open to feed the widows, the laborers, the thralls who had no land of their own. A simple loaf, passed from hand to hand, carried the unspoken promise that no one would be left entirely to hunger's mercy. Even so, when supplies ran critically low, families made agonizing choices. A parent might give the last portion to a child, knowing the sacrifice might shorten the day of the one who gave. Neighbors bartered small trinkets and tools for a handful of grain. Thralls saved the scraps of bark bread to trade for a flask of salted fish. These acts of quiet generosity held a community together when nature threatened to tear it apart. The sagas celebrate the great deeds of warriors and the striking victories of jarls, but they seldom tell of the mothers who scraped bark from trees so their children could choose something more than ashes. They do not speak of the old men who danced with exhaustion as they hoisted sacks of grain into the loft at dawn, only to hobble back to the hearth and sip the bitter gruel they had helped prepare. And so the real Viking world existed in two halves, the glittering, thunderous feasts of the powerful and the hushed determination of the common people. On feast nights, the jarls proclaimed their strength. On quiet mornings, the farmers and thralls proclaimed theirs. For them, survival was the greatest conquest of all. The world remembers the feasts. It remembers the horns raised high, the skins of beasts stretched across the tables, the songs that echoed under vaulted roofs. But Viking history was held together by those who survived without them, by those who ate in silence and never gave up. Their endurance in the face of hunger, their ingenuity in stretching every scrap of food, and their willingness to share the last crumb defined what it truly meant to be Viking. Their silent victory was one of simple will, passed down from one generation to the next, a legacy not of silver or steel, but of the unbreakable human spirit. A harsh land, a short season. The Viking homeland was not made for abundance. It was carved from cold, rugged terrain of windswept fjords, rocky coastlines, and mountains that stole sunlight from the soil. Salt spray lashed the cliffs, and winter storms roared down valleys, scouring the earth bare. In southern Norway, a handful of fertile valleys threaded between snow-capped peaks, but venture northward into the fjords of Troms, or the volcanic fields of Iceland and arable land shrank to narrow strips along sheltered inlets. Everywhere the soil was thin, acidic, and easily washed away by spring floods. In many places, workable earth was hard-won only by decades of cutting back forest and hauling away boulders. Against this backdrop, the growing season was brutally short, sometimes just 90 days between last frost and the first fall freeze. 90 days to clear land, prepare furrows, sow seed, tend crops, weed, harvest grain, gather herbs, dry fish, and store enough provisions to last through 8 dark, frozen months. Farmers measured time not by weeks or months, but by natural signs. When the first swallows arrived, when the birch buds unfurled, when the heather began to bloom, they planted at dawn, plowed until dusk, and prayed to Freyr for gentle rains and warm sunshine. Every season was a gamble against the whims of weather. Within that slender window, success was never guaranteed. A sudden cold snap in late July could blacken the heads of barley, turning golden promise into a stunted, shriveled crop. Weeks of relentless rain might flood root beds, leaving parsnips and turnips rotten beneath the sod. A mysterious blight could strike the flax fields, ruining both fiber and seed. And if the harvest failed, if only half the grain ripened, you did not simply lose a feast, you risked losing your family. There were no second plantings, no winter imports, no alternative sources of calories beyond what the land itself provided. Crops like barley, rye, oats, and flax formed the backbone of Viking agriculture. Barley thrived in cooler climates and was made into coarse loaves and hearty beer. Rye produced darker bread and a warming ale. Oats filled gruel bowls and lent texture to porridge cakes. Flax yielded fine linen and nutritious seeds pressed for oil. Yet these hardy grains were vulnerable. Stalks bent beneath heavy rain, heads snapped in mid-ripening by hail, and kernels sprouted in the ear if the harvest was delayed by damp fields. In lean years, farmers sometimes harvested half-ripe grain, pale and chalky. It produced bread that tasted of raw starch and left a bitter film in the mouth. Gruel made from this immature grain was hard to digest and offered fewer calories, but when faced with an empty larder, even half-formed kernels were better than nothing. Vegetables were few, small, and deeply seasonal. There were no potatoes. Europe would not see them for another 6 centuries. No tomatoes, no peppers, no citrus. Instead, Viking gardeners coaxed life from turnips, parsnips, cabbage, and leeks. Root beds nestled close to hearth smoke, using the warmth to extend the season by a few weeks. Cabbages, dense and cold-tolerant, survived until December if buried in compost. Leeks yielded slender green stalks through most of autumn. Yet even these crops were touched by fluctuation. A cold snap at flowering time turned turnip flesh woody, and cabbage heads split in soggy ground. Beyond cultivated beds lay the wild harvests, foraging for nettles, sorrel, dandelion, and sea kale, added vitamins and flavor to otherwise monotonous meals. Fishermen and women gathered seaweed along the shoreline, bladderwrack kelp, laverto dry for winter soups. Berry picking parties in midsummer brought home wild strawberries and bilberries, while cloudberries offered golden bursts of sweetness in August. But wild foods were ephemeral and unreliable. A dry spring could wither nettles, a fierce summer flood could wash away berry patches, and a warm autumn rain could shatter clouds of ripe fruit before they were gathered. Preservation, then, became the art of every household. Drying, smoking, salting, fermenting, and pickling were not culinary choices, but matters of survival. Long racks of cod and herring stood along coastlines, filleted and left to freeze dry in the cold, wind turning into stockfish, leathery monuments that could last for years. Smokehouses perched above the tree line, where alder and juniper wood lent subtle aroma to slabs of pork and strips of trout. Salt, a prized commodity traded from silver-mined regions or brought by merchants, coated every fish and cut of meat. When salt ran low, families turned to fermentation. Cabbages and roots were mashed with whey or vinegar into tangy mixes that fought spoilage and fed the body with needed nutrients. Yet even the best-laid preservation plans could fail. A damp autumn might rehydrate dried fish into mold before it could be smoked again. Salt barrels might leak in rough seas. Fermentation pits could flood, drowning barrels of sauerkraut. And once winter fully descended, no amount of planning could summon back the sun or thaw hardened ground. Food was then measured and rationed. Ropes of dried fish cut strand by strand, handfuls of grain weighed before milling, a marrow bone split into minute pieces. Every bite was a choice weighed against the question, will this last until spring? With no safety net beyond community stores and the goodwill of neighbors, mistakes in planning were fatal. A child with a hollowed belly bore silent witness to a parent's miscalculation. A weakened elder stooped over a bowl of porridge reminded the household of the stakes at hand. In the bleakest winters, local chieftains opened communal granaries, collections of tithes and surplus maintained in better years. But these reserves, too, could run dry after successive bad seasons. This harsh reality shaped not only Viking food, but Viking culture itself. In a land of cold earth and short seasons, resourcefulness became more valuable than strength. The wisest farmer-own who knew microclimates, who layered plantings, who traded surplus for salt might outlast a more powerful neighbor. Mothers' tales taught children how to find edible greens beneath snowdrifts, how to tell when birch sap was rising, how to harvest lichen without poisoning it. Elder councils debated strategies for water diversion, terracing, and seed exchange. Knowledge of the land, its rhythms and patterns, was treasured like gold. They did not feast through winter. Instead, they fought through a tone meal at a time. Mornings began with a thin soup of barley and whey, spooned into wooden bowls by candlelight. Midday brought a small ration of dried fish, softened in broth. Evenings returned to gruel, sometimes enriched with a few leaves of dried sorrel or a pinch of sea salt. Between meals, hands repaired nets, sharpened plow blades, or wove straw mats to insulate root stores. Bodies weakened by hunger forced communities to strengthen their bonds, sharing chores, pooling resources, and rotating watch over communal food pits. When spring thaw finally arrived, it did so in measured phases, trickles of water under snow, green shoots pushing through mud, birds returning to reed beds. Seed stores, stretched perilously thin by months of rationing, were used first for new plantings rather than for any culinary use. The first harvest of young greens nettles, picked when tender wild asparagus foraged in hidden gullies, became a celebration, a tasting of freedom after months of measured bites. A communal feast followed planting, with small plates of fresh herbs and porridge sweetened with cloudberry jam. It was a reminder that life, though fragile, would endure. In the minds of the Vikings, the struggle against the elements infused their deities with new urgency. Freyr, god of fertility and harvest, was petitioned not for glory on the battlefield, but for gentle rains and warm sun. Offerings of early barley, salt-cured fish, or carved wooden plow charms were placed in sacred groves. Festivals marked planting and harvest times, punctuating the year with hope rather than excess. Yet even faith required action. Prayer alone would not clear boulders or mend a broken plow. This interplay of faith and labor, of ritual and hard work, became the core of Viking identity. Their sagas recount journeys across open seas and battles won, but real heroism lived in the endurance of families who coaxed food from stony slopes, in the communal bonds forged over barrels of salted cod, and in the quiet gatherings around modest hearths, where elders taught children that every harvest was a gift earned and every seed a promise. The land gave nothing without effort, but those who listened to its rhythms survived and, in doing so, defined what it meant to be a Viking. They did not conquer the landscape, they adapted to it, learned from it, and wove its harsh beauty into their songs and stories. In a place of cold earth and fleeting light, they found a kind of strength not measured by sword or shield, but by seasons endured and seeds sown. And when the snow thawed at last, they emerged tired, lean but unbroken, ready to plant again, to gather again, and to face another year in a land where life itself was the greatest victory. Bark bread and boiled bones. When the harvest failed, or the long winter closed in, the Viking diet shifted from simple to desperate. Stored grain dwindled, smokehouses emptied, and even the salted fish that once hung from rafters had vanished. In that moment, families turned to ingenuity born of necessity. The most striking example was bark bread. Ordinary Viking bread was made from barley, rye, or oat scores, and dark, but nourishing enough when times were good. In hardship, however, those precious grains were mixed with whatever else could be ground into flour, pea husks, chaff, and above all, the inner bark of trees. This bark came not from the rough outer layer, but from the soft cambium beneath, scraped carefully from pine or birch trunks. Women and children set out into the forests in late winter, when the snow had softened but before the sap began to rise. Armed with knives and scrapers, they removed thin strips of cambium, laid them on stones to dry, then pounded them into powder with wooden mallets. The resulting bark flour was bitter and fibrous, but it added bulk when real grain was almost gone. Back in the longhouse, the final handfuls of barley or rye were sifted and mixed with bark flour. Water was added to form a stiff dough that was awkward to knead. The loaves or flat cakes baked slowly on a hot stone or in a simple oven built of clay and turf. When they emerged, the cakes were dark and dense, the aroma faintly woody. Biting into one was an exercise in patience. The crust scraped the gums, and the interior resisted every chew. Yet the cake filled the belly, and for a family on the brink of starvation, that was enough. Bark bread was not without consequence. Its high fiber content could irritate the digestive tract, causing cramps or bloating. The acrid taste lingered long after the bread was swallowed. Teeth wore down faster against the coarse particles, and cracks sometimes formed along the enamel. Parents knew these risks, but the alternative was far worse. When a child's cheeks grew hollow and sleep offered no relief, bark bread became both punishment and salvation. Beyond the last crusts of bark bread lay an even starker resource: bones. When the salt fish and smoked meats were gone, and the animals had long since been slaughtered in autumn, no part of any carcass was wasted. Cattle bones, pig ribs, goat skeletons, and even deer antlers found their way into iron cooking pots. By cracking open the larger bones, families exposed marrow that was scooped out and eaten raw or mixed into gruel for extra fat and flavor. The remaining bones were simmered for hours, sometimes days, in water over low coals. This drawn-out boil extracted every last scrap of nutrition: gelatin from tendons, collagen from ligaments, oil from marrow. The resulting broth was thin and oily, with a faint, meaty taste that teased the senses. Spoonfuls of this liquid were ladled over gruel to lend substance, poured into wooden cups as a warming drink, or given to the sick to strengthen weakened bodies. In regions where hooved animals were common, hooves and hides underwent a similar fate. After the meat was stripped away, hooves were boiled until they released a sticky jelly. This hoof jelly, gelatinous and bland, was still prized for its fat content and collagen. Eaten alone or stirred into broth, it provided sustenance when nothing else would. Even the hair and sinew were sometimes rendered into lye, for cleaning nothing escaped use. Sour whey from cheese-making found its way into daily meals as well. When milk curdled, the liquid left over was often discarded. In famine, however, whey was saved and consumed as a thin, tangy drink or mixed with grain to extend porridge. It could also serve as a pickling medium for the last turnips or parsnips, offering a modest but critical source of vitamins when fresh produce was gone. Wild plants added rare bursts of flavor or nutrition. Foragers collected seaweed along rocky shores. Bladderwrack and kelpwitch were dried and stored for winter soups. Nettles, dandelion leaves, sorrel, and wild garlic were foraged in spring and summer, then dried or salted to season the bland broth of bones. In some localities, mushrooms or lichen supplemented meals, though only knowledgeable gatherers could safely identify the edible varieties. By the time spring approached, families had eked out survival through months of meager fare. Bark bread had been replaced by fresh leaves and roots. Bone broth gave way to tender sprouts and foraged greens. Those who lived through the hunger remembered each bitter bite as a testament to resilience. Mothers whispered the recipes and methods of cambium collection to their daughters. Fathers recounted the timing and temperature necessary to coax marrow from the smallest bones, teaching sons how to listen for the faint crack that signaled yield. These desperate measures carried a hidden dignity. Bark bread and boiled bones were not symbols of mere poverty, but of human will. Each loaf baked, each pot simmered, and each foraged plant represented choices made in the face of despair. In the longhouse, families huddled over the remnants of a cattle skeleton, as if it were a precious relic, each sip of broth a small victory. When a neighbor received a marrow-filled bone, the gift spoke of solidarity and compassion deeper than any silver coin. By the time harvests returned, and smokehouses refilled with fish and meat hung from rafters, the memory of hunger did not fade quickly. Bark bread left a bitter taste that lingered in tales and song. Boiled bones became part of household lore lessons in economy and endurance. Children who grew strong on these fares carried that strength into adulthood, building communities bound by shared trials. In the end, bark bread and boiled bones were not merely emergency rations. They were the threads that bound Viking society together. Through seasons of plenty, families feasted and celebrated. In seasons of want, they relied on deep knowledge passed down through generations, and in both, they affirmed their identity, resourceful, hardy, and unbroken. The sagas may praise the heroes who sailed the seas and swung swords, but the truest saga of Viking life lies in the quiet kitchens where bark was pounded, bones were boiled, and the unbreakable will to survive shone brightest. Fish, rot, and fermentation. Protein was a luxury in the Viking world, and for the poor, meat was scarce. A family might slaughter a goat or sheep once a year, or receive scraps from a lord's hunt, but those occasions were rare. The true staple protein for most common Viking households came not from the forest or field, but from the sea. Fish was the lifeline that carried them through the long, dark winters. In summer and early autumn, when the weather was calm enough to launch small open boats, fishermen cast nets or dangled lines over wooden railings. Cod, herring, haddock, and flatfish were hauled aboard in bulk, their silver sides flashing in the sunlight. Shorelines rang with the sound of fish thumping onto planks as crews sorted their catch. Every haul was precious, destined to feed families immediately, and then sustain them when the ice swallowed the world. Preservation was vital. Without any form of refrigeration, the Vikings turned to drying, salting, smoking, and, in some regions, fermentation to keep fish edible for months or even years. Along sheltered inlets and rocky coves, long wooden racks called hill were erected, sometimes stretching for hundreds of meters. Filleted fish were nailed to these racks and left to air dry in the cold, salty wind. Over days and weeks, the flesh turned tough and leathery, transforming into stockfish. This dried staple could last through endless winters, yet it was hard to chew and nearly flavorless. Before cooking, the fish had to be beaten with a wooden mallet to break the fibers. In addition to air drying, salt was used wherever it could be obtained. Salted fish was piled into wooden barrels with layers of coarse salt, squeezing out moisture and creating an environment hostile to bacteria. When a barrel was opened in winter, the fish were brine-soaked and stiff. Villagers would soak the salt away in fresh water, changing the water several times, then boil the fish into thick stews or shred it into porridge for added protein. Salted and dried, herring in particular became a staple food traded over vast distances, exchanged for grain, timber, or metalwork. Smoking added another layer of preservation. In smokehouses and over open hearths, fish hung from rafters or skewered on poles above smoldering embers of alder or juniper wood. Smoke infused the flesh, creating a deep, earthy flavor and driving off moisture. As the smoke curled through rafters, it also added a protective coating of soot that repelled insects and mold. By the time winter fully set in, smoked trout or mackerel hung around every hearth, ready to be boiled or fried as needed. Yet among these preservation methods, one of the most infamous was fermentation. In coastal communities from Norway to Iceland and Greenland, fish was allowed to decay under controlled conditions. Greenland shark, whose fresh flesh is toxic, required special treatment. Its high levels of urea and trimethylamine oxide could cause severe illness if eaten fresh. To render it safe, Vikings buried the meat underground or packed it in gravel for weeks or months. Buried in shallow pits above the high tide line, the fish rotted and dangerous compounds leached away. After this process, the flesh, called hakarl, emerged as a soft, pale meat soaked in ammonia, releasing a pungent odor that could empty a room. Registered visitors to Greenland centuries later described the smell as akin to strong urine. The taste was salty and tangy, but the protein it provided was indispensable. For many, it was not optional. In the dead of winter, when the sea iced over and farms lay barren beneath snowdrifts. Even slightly spoiled fish, moldy or sour smelling, might be eaten without hesitation. Children learned early to identify the difference between dangerous rot and acceptable fermentation. Elders passed down warnings. If the fish felt slimy to the touch or black mold coated the flesh, it must be discarded. If it smelled of ammonia and had a firm, waxy feel, it was fit for the pot. Those lessons could mean the difference between survival and sickness. Rot, in this context, became a tool. Fermentation pits were lined with stones or straw. Barrels were covered with turf to maintain a steady, cool temperature, and holes were drilled in lids to allow gases to escape. When harvests failed on land, these fermented stores were sometimes the only reliable source of calories. A bowl of hackarl broth might be all that some families had for days at a time. Salted and fermented fish were not the only flavors of cold water protein. Shellfish mussels, cockles, and periwinkles were foraged at low tide and cooked over open flames. While not as calorie-dense as cod or herring, they supplemented diets and added variety. In rocky pools, sea urchins were collected, and the roe eaten raw or mixed into stews during spring thaw. All of these sea gifts helped stave off scurvy and protein deficiency. On occasion, small fish like whitebait were fried whole. They were dredged in barley or oat flour and cooked in animal fat until crisp. These snacks were passed around as a welcome break from the monotony of gruel and bone broth. Tavern keepers in coastal settlements sometimes served plates of fresh fish, offering a rare moment of indulgence. Despite the ingenuity, the harsh reality remained. Starvation had no palate. To modern eyes, the Viking diet may seem grotesque, eating what smelled of rot, chewing dry slabs of stockfish until jaws ached, swallowing sour meat in stews. But for Viking peasants, these were not delicacies. They were lifelines. Parents watched children swallow bitter, ammonia-tinged bites because each mouthful was a promise of another day. The reliance on the sea also shaped community rhythms. Fishing expeditions were communal efforts. Neighbors helped repair nets, built boats, and manned lines together. After each haul, everyone gathered at the racks to fillet and hang fish, creating a collective sense of purpose. Songs and chants accompanied these labors, turning monotonous tasks into shared rituals. In the evenings around the hearth, hands that had scraped scales and strung lines now wove tales of sea monsters and storms, of voyages to distant lands, of the gods who ruled the waves. These rituals forged social bonds that extended beyond immediate kin. In times of scarcity on land, fishermen from one fjord would row to another to lend nets or share barrels of stockfish. Salt, a finite resource in many regions, was sent as a gift to inland villages, and in return, inland farmers sent small sacks of barley or whey. Through such exchanges, remote communities were knitted into broader networks of mutual support. When spring finally loosened the grip of winter, the sea thawed first. Small streams of open water followed, carrying driftwood and seaweed to shore. This marked the beginning of a new season of abundance. Boats skimmed over glassy fjords, nets filled with fresh herring, and women gathered seaweed for drying. After months of winter scarcity, the taste of fresh fish, flaky, mild, and sweet, was a revelation. Celebrations accompanied the first salting and smoking of the new catch, reaffirming the community's reliance on and respect for the sea. In a land where the sea gave more than the soil, fish-even rotting was a gift that could not be refused. The rituals of drying, salting, smoking, and fermenting defined Viking food culture. They were not mere culinary techniques, but lifeways born of necessity and shaped by environment. Each method preserved not just fish, but hope, sustenance that carried families through darkness and cold. And so, when we speak of Vikings as warriors, raiders, and explorers, we must also remember them as fishermen, foragers, and preservers. Their survival hinged on understanding the sea, its moods, its dangers, and its generosity. Rot and fermentation were as vital as steel and sail. In a world without ease, the pungent smell of hackarl and the crack of drying stockfish were as familiar to them as hearth smoke and lullabies. In that smell lay the unspoken truth. In the struggle against nature's extremes, the ingenuity to turn rot into sustenance was the greatest triumph of all. Gruel, weeds, and raw endurance. In the Viking world, daily meals were never about delight. They were about survival. For most people, farmers eking out a living on marginal land, fishermen battered by storms, landless laborers working for meager wages, and enslaved thralls bound to their master's fields, food was a blunt instrument. Simple, repetitive, and brutally utilitarian. There was no room for variety, no luxury of choice. Each meal was engineered to fill the belly, if only barely, before turning the mind back to the work of staying alive. At the center of this survival diet stood porridge and gruel. These were not the creamy, fragrant bowls that modern cooks imagine. They were coarse, gloopy concoctions made from the cheapest grain available: barley, oats, rye, or whatever remained after the miller's best flour was sifted away. In late winter, when animal milk had long since dried up, that porridge might be boiled in thin, watery byproduct of cheese-making, giving it a faint tang but little richness. On the rare occasions when fresh milk was on hand, it might replace water, but only enough to turn the mixture from chalky mush into a slightly creamier slop. Each morning began with a bowl of this gruel, its cloudy surface broken by floating skins of grain and occasional flecks of moss or lichen. Hands numbed by frost grasped wooden spoons carved generations earlier, and faces bent over the hearth light, finding neither pleasure nor comfort in the ritual. Still, it granted the carry-through to midday. To extend the scant portions, Viking women, especially mothers responsible for large families, became masters of improvisation. In spring and summer, they led children into wetlands and forest clearings in search of wild greens. Nettles, once blanched to remove sting, added bulk. Dandelion leaves lent a bitter sharpness. Wild garlic imparted a hint of aroma. Sorrel brightened the taste with a tart edge. In regions where mosses grew thick, thin strips of reindeer moss or Icelandic lichen were collected, dried, and ground to a powder that swelled in the gruel, thickening it into something more filling. These foraged additions were not culinary experiments. They were life preservers. During the warmer months, foraging was as essential as plowing or seeding. Crews of women and children roamed the shoreline at low tide, gathering bladderwrack and kelp that were later dried on racks of driftwood, destined to flavor winter broth. In marshes, they dug for root plants: watercress, wild parsnip, and burdock, whose edible tubers, once peeled and sliced, offered more substance than the threadbare gruel alone. Berry-picking parties became communal events. Bilberries, crowberries, and strawberries were plucked by handfuls, eaten fresh in celebration, or dried on racks to sweeten the darkest months. These activities wove families into the landscape's rhythms and turned fields, forests, and seashores into vital larders. But come winter, foraging ceased. Deep snow blanketed every edible plant, and icy winds stripped tree branches bare. Then, households retreated to what they had preserved: dried seaweed, turnips packed in straw-lined pit, houses, and sour greens fermented in whey or vinegar. Those pits dug into sunken floors and layered with brush to keep frost at bay housed dried roots and cabbages preserved in brine. Each barrel, uncorked in midwinter, released a pungent aroma, reminding families of the labor and hope buried there months before. The cold did not end hunger, it simply made endurance more urgent. Dairy offered occasional reprieve, but only briefly. Hard-working goats outlasted cows in the cold climes, their milk thicker and more resilient to chill. Still, as temperatures plunged, even goat's milk slowed to a trickle. The peasant turned that souring into advantage. Clotted curds boiled into gruel added richness. Thin, fermented whey became a tangy drink or brine for vegetables. Butter, churned when fresh milk arrived in autumn, was hoarded in wooden tubs sealed with animal fat to fend off freezer-like staleness. Every drop counted. A sliver of butter melted into a morning porridge was as prized as a slice of honeyed bread. Eggs, too, were too rare to break casually. Only the wealthiest farmers kept flocks of fowl, and those hens laid only in warmer months. Each egg was either bartered for a thorn-proof glove or reserved for childbirth ceremonies, when a hen's egg was believed to bring strength to both mother and child. In winter, when a single egg might fetch enough grain for a week's supply of gruel, breaking it for breakfast was unthinkable. Folk songs warned of the shame of a household that squandered eggs, embedding cautionary tales in children's minds. Honey liquid gold for many cultures was beyond reach for most Vikings. If a family had access to wild beehives in spring, the honey harvested was used sparingly, a spoonful to sweeten a midwinter mead, or in sacred offerings to gods like Freyr. To waste honey on everyday porridge was akin to burning precious wood to heat the soil. It simply never happened. This life of unrelenting simplicity forged a communal ethos. In each village, barns and storehouses held communal reserves set aside for famine years. When a household faced ruin, the elder might order a ration from the common Tithingen Act that tied every member of the community to each other's welfare. No one starved alone. The sharing of a single barrel of dried turnips or a portion of salted greens affirmed a deeper solidarity than any feast among jarls. Even the act of eating became communal. Long benches around the hearth were low and close. Neighbors shared bowls of gruel, passing spoons in silence as they nodded respect to each other's hardship. Fathers returned from fields or fishing boats, rubbed the salt and sweat from their brows, and ate beside their children before extinguishing the hearth embers and wrapping the household in fur blankets. Those moments, stripped of ceremony, bound families as tightly as any banquet ever could. Through it all, endurance itself became a form of quiet heroism. Every spoonful of porridge gray, bland and sticky, was a testament to human will. Each handful of stinging nettles folded into gruel signaled mother's devotion. The sight of a child turning the thin whey in a wooden bowl into a face of grim determination embodied the frontier spirit of the North. In seasonal cycles, the people measured their lives not by victories or voyages, but by the turning of seasons and the capacity to eke out the next meal. And so, for those who lived in the Viking world's margins, gruel and weeds were not symbols of failure, they were lifelines. In every grain boiled and every leaf foraged lay a story of resourcefulness, community, and unbroken resolve. The harshest winters left their marks on bodies and hearts, but they also revealed the raw endurance that defined an entire culture. In a land where food was never taken for granted, the simplest meals became daily affirmations of the will to survive, and that, more than any feast, was the true sustenance of the Viking people. Famine in the gods. Hunger in the Viking world was never simply a matter of an empty stomach. It was an affliction of body, mind, and spirit. When the larder ran low and the snows pressed on the turf walls, a sense of abandonment settled over a village. Fields that once whispered promise under summer suns lay barren beneath frost. Streams that sang through the valleys froze to silence. In such times, the people did not merely endure physical discomfort, they wrestled with the unsettling thought that the gods had turned their faces away. The Old Norse sagas and Eddic poems are threaded with laments for lean years and failed crops. Skalds composed verses recalling great hungriness that gnawed at children's bones or withheld the milk from the kine. These tales were not distant myth. They were fresh memories passed from one generation to the next. Parents would recall the winter when the barley failed twice in succession, when even the stored dried fish tasted like ashes, and when every mouthful of thin gruel felt like a small betrayal of hope. Such stories became part of clan identity, shaping family lore and local traditions. At the heart of these narratives stood Freyr, the Vanir god of fertility, harvest, prosperity, and peace, a deity whose favor meant the difference between abundance and starvation. Unlike Odin, the war god who presided over battles and the afterlife, Freyr was intimately tied to the soil. His image, often a carved wooden statuette of a handsome figure with a hefty belly, was set in communal groves known as Vi, where villagers gathered in spring to offer ritual grain and blood. During sowing season, small sheaves of the first barley ears were woven into wreaths and placed at his feet. In autumn, once the last sheaf was cut, it was split and shared among families in a silent vow of gratitude. When desperation deepened, offerings grew more elaborate. Goats or pigs were led to stone altars, their throats slit so that life's blood spattered onto carved runes and drinking horns. That blood was sprinkled across doorways and thresholds, a plea for Freyr's mercy to seep into every household. In the darkest accounts whispered by later Christian chroniclers, human sacrifice was said to have occurred, a child or slave laid upon the altar when all else had failed. Whether these stories reflect isolated horrors or the smoke of rumor, they reveal the profound lengths to which people would go to bring back the sun and the rain. But prayer alone could not stave off starvation. Recognizing this, Viking communities erected practical defenses against famine. Communal grain house storehouses built on stone pilings to keep out pests stockpiled barley, oats, and rye during good years. These granaries, overseen by local chieftains or respected elders, held tithes and surplus contributed by every household. Along coastlines, long racks held mountains of drying fish, cured and salted to last until the thaw. Inland villages maintained smokehouses for hams and strips of venison. These communal stores were not private hoards but lifelines, released in controlled rations when hunger threatened the weak. Yet even these systems could be overwhelmed. Archaeologists digging in former Viking settlements have unearthed storage pits littered with spoilt, grain tangled with mold and insect casings, a sobering testament to years when disease or damp ruined entire larders. In burial mounds, the skeletons of children provide heartbreaking evidence. Stunted stature, porous bone cortex, and wafer-thin ribs speak of chronic malnutrition. Adults, too, bear scars of deprivation, healed fractures that took longer to mend due to lack of nutrients, enamel defects from infancy, and spinal markers of heavy workloads when bodies were at their weakest. These hard signs in stone and soil underscore that famine was not an occasional hardship, but a recurring specter. In spite of, or perhaps because of such trials, faith and community intertwined ever more tightly. In seasons of plenty, grand harvest feasts honored Freyr with horns of beer and joints of roasted meat. All who lived beneath his protection joined in, but in lean years, communal rituals took on a solemn gravity. At dawn, villagers would process to the V, carrying torches and carrying gifts of the smallest grains. Hymns chanted in unison rose with the smoke of incense, forging a bond of shared desperation and shared hope. Afterward, they returned to their homes and hearths, fortified by that collective act of devotion, ready to tackle the next day's grinding routine of boiling porridge, patching nets, or breaking bones for broth. Thus, hunger in the Viking world was not just nature's cruelty, it was a crucible of trust, of solidarity, and of faith in the unseen. It shaped bodies until they bore its marks, and shaped minds until they could recite its cycles like a calendar. But above all, it shaped belief. In a land where the forces of earth and sea, wind and frost could so easily snatch away life, the gods were not distant monarchs but intimate partners. To go hungry was to feel severed from that partnership. To survive was to renew it. And so, year after year, generation after generation, the Vikings tilled, prayed, stored, and endured ever, mindful that in their hands lay the final measure of their fate. Ingenuity over indulgence. Out on the storm-battered coasts and wind-whipped fields of the Viking world, survival was not a matter of feasting and revelry, but of ingenious adaptation. When nature offered only scant provisions and winter stripped the land bare, brute strength and martial prowess mattered little. Instead, the true test of a family's mettle lay in its ability to wring every scrap of sustenance from the meager resources at hand and to turn apparent waste into a lifeline. Every household, from the humblest cottage to the modest longhouse of a middling freeholder, became its own laboratory of preservation and invention. No morsel went unused. The day's leftover porridge, for example, was never discarded. Instead, it was gathered into rough patties, shaped by well-worn hands, and fried in animal fat over the low fire. These dense barley cakes, bitter, rich, and chewy, were eaten cold by field workers who needed portable fuel while tending distant plots of oats or flax. In a pinch, these cakes might be crumbled into stew or cradled in dried leaves to form an impromptu sandwich, ensuring that nothing edible slipped through fingers turned numb by frost. Stale loaves once prized for their dark crust hardened into living relics over weeks. Yet even these brittle bricks of bread found a purpose. Crumbled into bubbling kettles of soup, they swelled to thicken broth and lend body to herbal stews. In communities where the saltfish runs were small or the herds thin, this simple trick could stretch a single carcass far enough to feed half a dozen hungry mouths. Cheese rinds, too tough for teeth to break, were boiled like stubborn bones, their hidden fats seeping into the liquid. Each drop of dairy richness, coaxed out with patient heat, was a tiny victory against the winter's gnawing emptiness. The Vikings did not view preservation techniques as culinary flourish. They were matters of life and death. Smoking, for instance, was not merely a way to enhance flavor, but the primary method of sealing fish and meat against microbial spoilage. Fish strips were hung on rafters in smokehouses, where alder or juniper embers smoldered day and night, imparting a deep, resinous aroma that disguised the onset of rot and extended the fish's shelf life by months. When storms damaged these smokehouses, entire communities rallied to rebuild them. Such structures were as vital as granaries or wells. Salting was another indispensable practice. Salt, carried by traders from coastal salt pans or produced in small coastal evaporators, was treasured like silver. Cuts of pork, strips of dried cod, and even heads of brassica vegetables were packed in brine pits, where salt drew out moisture and created a hostile environment for bacteria. When thaw came, the salt-brined food was rinsed and boiled, preserving enough nourishment to sustain households through the long dead of winter. Beyond these well-known methods lay a trove of local innovations. In regions where clay was abundant, families crafted tightly sealed pots, waxed and buried in straw-lined underground pits. Into these vessels went layers of shredded fish, sour whey, and wild herbs. Over weeks, the contents fermented into pungent, protein, and fat-rich cakes. These were dug up and chopped into small chunks, used sparingly to flavor stews, or melted into thin, nourishing broths. The same technique applied to root vegetable parsnips and turnips, cut into slabs and layered with whey and herb-yielding food items that could survive months without spoilage. Nothing was wasted ever. Bones, once cracked and simmered for marrow, found their way back into the pot for a second boil, then a third, until every scrap of collagen, tendon, and oil had leached into the liquid. That bone broth was then shared among the weakest in the household, the elderly, the infirm, or the youngest children whose survival meant the community's future. Animal fat, rendered from scraps and trimmings, was poured into skin pouches and hung near the fire to melt and refill gaps in storage. Over time, those pouches were worked first into lamps to light the long winter nights, then into makeshift candles for dawn vigils and festive gatherings. Even the ashes from the hearth held value. When mixed with water and heated, they produced lye, the critical ingredient for soap making. This rough, black soap cleaned woolen garments and wooden dishes alike, preventing disease that might spread in cramped, damp quarters. In some households, the leftover lye solution was boiled down to create a crude fertilizer, returning scarce nutrients to fields in a cycle of renewal. This culture of resourcefulness did not spring from theory, but from necessity, and it was passed down with reverence. Mothers taught daughters to recognize the precise moment when porridge had begun to sour, but was still safe to cure into cakes, or to distinguish between beneficial fermentations and dangerous molds. Fathers instructed sons on the optimal ways to layer fish in brine, seal clay pots under wax, or fortify straw-lined pits against shifting frost. Forgetting even a single nuancia barrel corked too loosely, a smokehouse with a cracked plank could condemn an entire family to hardship. These practices created a quiet form of strength that stood in contrast to the glory of battle. While sagas celebrate the warrior's sword and shield, the real saga of Viking endurance played out in low kitchens and beneath sod roofs, in firelit corners where bark was pounded and bones were simmered. The widow who rose before dawn to knead a bitter dough had as much courage as the raider who set sail for distant shores. The thrall who labored to grind bark flour into fine powder secured the legacy of her children's lives. Crucially, ingenuity was communal. Neighbors bartered brine recipes and shared spare equipment. A farmer with surplus root vegetables exchanged with a fisherman for extra stockfish. Town meetings held under open skies when weather permitted often centered on food security issues, how to expand granaries, clear new forest plots for cambium gathering, or reinforce smokehouses against gales. In some settlements, preservation guilds formed, each family contributing skills or resources to build communal drying racks or teach fermentation methods to the young. At its core, this relentless innovation reflected a worldview in which nothing was ever truly lost, only transformed. Resources passed from one form to another, grains to cakes, fish to leather-like stockfish, bones to nourishing broth, mirroring the cycles of nature itself. Just as fields lay fallow in winter only to burst forth in spring, so did foodstuffs undergo metamorphoses, emerging stronger, more resilient, and better adapted to the challenges ahead. In the end, And it was not the mightiest warrior or the wealthiest chieftain who set the terms of survival, but the clever and careful, the relentless souls who saw opportunity in the husk of a turnip or the scrap of a bone. Their legacy endures in the sagas of long winters and in the archaeological remains of clay pots and pressed bones, silent testaments to a people who refused to surrender to scarcity. In a land where indulgence was a luxury few could afford, ingenuity became the greatest virtue and survival, the highest form of triumph. What endured? When we think of Viking, our minds often conjure images of warriors astride longships, axes raised high as blades met shields with thunderous clamor. We recall berserkers who howled into the fray, their rage an unstoppable force. We remember explorers charting distant shores in search of new lands. We speak of sagas inscribed on runestones and in the Great Hall, tales of conquest and glory that echo through the ages. Yet for every warrior who wielded a sword, there existed dozens who wielded much humbler tools: wooden spoons, grinding stones, and bread paddles. The true measure of Viking endurance lies not only in military feats, but in the quiet, uncelebrated acts of daily survival. In cottages nestled against fjords, women rose before dawn, arms stiff from frost, to tend the remains of yesterday's fire. With heavy stones and worn querns, they ground the last of the day's grain into coarse flour. When the harvest was lean, they scraped bark from birch and pine trees, pounded the inner cambium into powder, and blended it with barley or rye to bake bitter bark bread for their families. Their fingers cracked and bled in the process, but the bread they formed in small loaves was the difference between life and death. That act, kneading a dough of half bark, half grain over a frigid hearth, was as heroic in its own right as swinging an axe at the enemy. Mothers, especially, bore their sacrifices in silence. They rationed sour milk and thin whey among children whose pale cheeks sank into hollow hollows. In the small hours of the morning, they tiptoed to the corners of the longhouse, where bundles of dried herbs and seaweed hung, and whispered prayers for better days. They swallowed the bitter memories of their own hunger, so their children would taste only the faint sweetness that remained. They sang lullabies to whisper comfort, masking the gurgle of an empty stomach with notes of hope. Fathers, when they returned from the coast, often brought nothing more than a single salted fish. That fish, glazed in brine and stiff from drying racks, was more precious than a mound of silver. Divided into slivers, it provided protein for a family for days. Each slice was chewed slowly, its saltiness a reminder of both the sea's generosity and its unforgiving power. In the trading hall, a father might barter that fish for a handful of grain or a chunk of goat cheese rind salvaged from last season's stores. Such exchanges were not commerce in the sense of luxury. They were lifelines, drawn from shared necessity and mutual respect. Children, born into the harsh rhythms of the North, became warriors of a different sort. Before they could read or recite the runes, they learned to forage for wild roots, to identify bitter sorrel and nutrient-rich nettles hidden among the drifts of snowmelt. They gnawed on dried fish skins like dog-ear chews, licking away every last ounce of fat. They carried sticks to pound lichens into powder, adding the pale green flakes to their bowls of gruel. Their games often imitated the adult world. They pretended that sticks were spears, that drifts of snow were mountain passes to be conquered. But these games also sharpened their senses, teaching them where to find hidden bounty and how to stretch a single loaf of bread across as many mouths as needed. The elders, the ones who had seen far too many winters, served as living repositories of knowledge. Their faces, etched in lines deeper than any carved rune, held the memory of seasons when the granaries had failed, and even the salted fish had spoiled. They remembered the taste of lichen soup so vividly that a single mouthful still conjured shivers of both despair and triumph. They understood that the world turned on subtle signs: the slant of sun before dawn, the thickness of ice forming on the river, the first tremor of frost in the grass. These were the true calendars by which a Viking lived, and to ignore them was to invite catastrophe. These elders passed down rituals and recipes with near religious reverence. Dried seaweed was soaked in spring water and draped across wooden racks to air dry again, ensuring it survived until the next thaw. Bones from slaughtered animals were meticulously cracked, marrow scooped out, and boiled for hours until the broth ran a golden hue. The spent bones, once part of feasts, became tokens of solidarity. A bone broth, shared between neighbors, was an act of community. Every pot of stew contained not just food, but the unspoken promise that no one would face hunger alone. Their wisdom also manifested in seasonally timed gatherings. In early autumn, villagers convened to celebrate the harvest that was, however meager, and to allocate communal stores for the coming winter. They measured out grain rations on communal tables, carved each portion with careful precision, and recorded the allocations on wooden tally sticks. At the winter solstice, they lit bonfires in sacred groves, offering the first cuts of salted meat to Freyr in hopes that the new year would bring fertile fields and mild weather. These ceremonies fused spirituality and practicality, reinforcing social bonds and ensuring that every act of devotion had a tangible benefit. This was the substance of their legacy, not a glittering hoard of gold or the roar of shields on the battlefield, but the quiet persistence of daily life. They did not leave behind towering monuments or sprawling kingdoms. Instead, they inscribed their endurance in small details: the charred rim of a bread oven, the worn patterns on a quern stone, the cellar lined with stubborn jars of pickled turnips. Archaeologists working centuries later would uncover these artifacts, and through them glimpse the intricate dance of hardship and ingenuity that defined the Viking spirit. Indeed, their greatest conquest was over scarcity itself. Where other societies might have collapsed under repeated famine, the Vikings adapted. They turned scarcity into strength by fostering interdependence. Families exchanged goods and skills, forging networks of mutual aid that stretched from sheltered bays to mountain villages. They treated the land not as an adversary, but as a partner in a delicate negotiation, coaxing food from rock-strewn fields and brutal winters with a deep understanding of local ecology. Spring's thaw, when it finally arrived, was both relief and new beginning. Meltwater ran in silver rivulets, carrying with it the scent of earth reborn. Green shoots pushed through thawing ground, and the first batch of sheep's wool was spun into yarn that would warm hands and homes. The taste of fresh berries, wild strawberries, bilberries in the tongue felt like a benediction after months of gruel. That first gulp of dairy milk, rich and creamy, inspired toasts and temporary feasts, each small celebration a direct rebuttal to winter's grip. Yet the memory of hardship lingered. Even in moments of plenty, a prudent Viking might set aside extra grain just in case. Elder women might still pound bark in secret, not out of expectation but as a ritual of preparedness. The youthful warriors who returned from raids and voyages carried back more than loot. They brought tales of foreign ports, spices, and grains unknown at home. But they also carried back the lessons of home, that food should never be wasted, that every ally might one day become a neighbor in need, and that survival was a communal art. And so, the enduring legacy of Viking life is less about raiding and more about resilience. It lies in the silent kitchens, where women baked bark bread by the glimmer of dawn, in the hearths where families huddled over bone broth, in the communal stores meticulously maintained despite ever-present risk. It rests in the songs of old women who sang of past calamities, in the praise poetry that lauded simple acts of survival alongside battlefield valor, and in the memories etched into every stone and striation of that rugged land. Not every Viking conquered the seas. Some conquered hunger quietly, daily, and without fanfare. And in that struggle lies a kind of greatness equal to any battlefield triumph, the strength to persist through scarcity, to pass down knowledge instead of wealth, and to shape a society bound not by conquest alone, but by an unbreakable will to survive. That will endures still, echoing in the marrow-deep lessons of endurance they left behind.